Good afternoon. We are here on a Monday again. Still didn't get around to it on Sundays after church, but wanted to share the message for the second week of Advent. I haven't been sharing them quite the same way, although again, they are always up on the church Facebook page, Windermere Heights Church on Facebook, so you can check them out there on Sundays. We're actually there live at 10 a.m., but through at least Advent, wanted to also post them on my personal page here for those of you that are following along, don't necessarily follow the church page. So on Sunday, like I said, second Sunday of Advent, we talked about what I perhaps should have titled, I think I prefer the title of the God of Sara, Elizabeth, and Mary. And normally we hear about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and certainly that's part of Scripture. But these were some very important women in the history and in the story that Scripture tells. And so one of the unique things then that we sometimes seem to miss about the events in Scripture is the presence of women, and particularly around the events of Jesus' birth and even Jesus' death. But obviously this time of the year we're talking about Jesus' birth. And women are central in that story. And it's not that we're unaware that the characters in the story are women. I think it's more that it doesn't strike us as significant, perhaps particularly notable. We live in a different time and a place, and the presence of women would not be that unusual and seems almost expected. But in the time of Jesus and in that part of the world at that time, giving women central parts in those stories would have been unusual and noteworthy. And for a number of reasons then we can look at, and we're going to look at that here in this message. Last week I read from Isaiah chapter 43, verses 18 and 19, and it said this: "Forget the former things, do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it?" Well, this idea of God having the power to do a new thing often finds its expression in God doing what is a seemingly impossible thing. Something where God enters into a hopeless situation and does something that no one saw coming, or maybe even could see coming. And this impossible thing, on several occasions in Scripture, is God enabling women who were thought to be unable to bear children to actually have children. Abraham's wife, Sara, is perhaps the most familiar example of that kind of story. But in the events leading up to the birth of Jesus, we have a woman named Elizabeth, who was also well past her childbearing years and had not borne any children. And she becomes pregnant with who will become John the Baptist in the stories, who would be the one to lay the groundwork eventually for the announcement that Jesus was the Messiah and that people would follow him then. And in that story, it's God once again, with that pregnancy, declaring, "See, I am doing a new thing. Do you not perceive it?" God is doing a new thing, and an unexpected thing in the world. And we need to pay attention to those moments in time. And there are things we can learn about the way that God works there. So Sara and Elizabeth, in many ways, are representative of us all, men and women both. Brian McLaren, in his book, We Make the Road by Walking, explains it this way. He says, "We all feel that we have the capacity to give birth to something beautiful and good and needed and wonderful in the world. But our potential goes unfulfilled, and our promising hopes miscarry. So we live on one side and then the other of the border of despair." I've been there. I suspect most of us have been there from time to time. You prepare, for example, all your life for something and find that something either no longer exists or what you have prepared for no longer applies. It's like the old saying, just when I thought I had all the answers, they went and changed all the questions. Life's like that. It happens to all of us in big and small ways. Over the years, I've teased about this stupid, ugly minivan that we had to drive when we first had 3 children as opposed to only 1. And that van was ugly. I mean, it had the genuine simulated wood grain panels. It had like a red velvet interior, but it was a necessary means. It was what we could afford at the time to travel around with our small family, which was actually a growing family at that point. And it's not really a big deal, but it wasn't what I had envisioned driving when I was a teenager or even when we first got married. It wasn't part of what I had hoped for. And of course, that's just a small thing. But there are also those moments, for example, when you thought maybe you knew what success would look like. And you learned through hard experience maybe that success or faithfulness and doing what is right don't always land you in a place that everybody would necessarily call successful. Sometimes success in that way, by being faithful, by doing the right thing, can actually land you in a place that feels more like failure or at least compromise. And that's a bigger thing. And of course, then there's the very real experience for women who, like Sara or Elizabeth, imagined their younger years would have been spent mothering and were disappointed to discover that they couldn't conceive or they have lost children to miscarriage. And there's a profound sense of loss and subsequent questions about all kinds of other things in one's life when we go through those difficulties. These kinds of things are big, difficult things to face and to walk through. So stories then like the ones about Sara or Elizabeth remind us that we serve a God who is the Father of a pregnant world, or a world pregnant with possibilities that we haven't imagined. And he's still at work long after we might have given up hoping, long after we think it was reasonable to keep trying or hoping. God eventually does for the world what he promised he would do in story after story throughout Scripture. And again, it's no small thing that it is through women that God chooses to bring his power to light in this way. God speaks through the voice of the voiceless in that world, which brings us to the second woman we want to talk about, or the third woman we want to talk about today, which is Mary. You see, Mary was, unlike Sara or Elizabeth, a young woman who had not yet been married. And we're all familiar with the story of her being visited by an angel and told that she would become pregnant, even though she had not been married or with a man at that point. Mary so courageously responds in that story to the news that she would be with child, and that child would be brought to her through this power of the Spirit. And she responds, "May it be to me as you have said." Now, we often get caught up in the virgin birth thing. It's pretty unbelievable that Mary could be pregnant at all, and that's true. And yet another example of the seemingly impossible being made possible, like it was in the cases of Sara and Elizabeth. When we hear of the impossible promises that are made in Scripture, like swords being beaten into plowshares or lions lying down with lambs, justice rolling down like a river in a world that seems so unjust, every tear being wiped away, every disease and sickness healed. Those are all things that just don't seem within our reach. They don't seem possible. But when we get to that place, we can remember that God has done the impossible in Sara and Elizabeth and in Mary. But in our focus on the act of the miracle itself, we may miss some of what it tries to tell us or what it's teaching us about who God is, who we are. Why a virgin birth, for example? Why not another Sara or Elizabeth? women who were well past childbearing years. One of the things we've been taught is that the virgin birth means that God is the father of this baby, and there should be no confusion about whether Jesus is God incarnate or simply a man chosen by God to be his representative in the world. Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And there's also some teaching out there then about sexual purity and the passing of the sin nature, but most of that is just rank speculation, honestly. But one of the things that is attested to in the understanding of how babies are made at that time is that it was the man who alone contributed the life-giving seed, and that the woman was simply the vessel in which the baby was grown until birth. If this was part of the understanding, then in this story, God through his Spirit is the father of the baby in such a way that the baby truly is the Son of God. Unlike the claim made by so many leaders at the time, pharaohs and Caesars, who claimed to be divine human hybrids, who were destined to rule and had the power to do so, and so often did with great violence and exercised that authority in ways that were destructive. But in the story of Mary and Jesus, we have God not imposing his will on a woman violently, but inviting her into this new story that God is telling about how the world should work. The child of this union is not some strange hybrid bred to rule with violent power over others, but to rule with a new kind of power, the power of love for humanity, the power of grace and invitation, the power of vulnerability as a baby, and ultimately a vulnerability even to death. God chose to bring true power to change the world through the cooperation of the so often called weaker sex, who gives birth to a son who is not like any other king, emperor, pharaoh, or world leader, in that he will not do violence, but he will suffer it. He would not claim his rights, but give them up to come to us. A God whose wisdom seems as foolishness to those who have been killing themselves for centuries, ignorant of who God really is and what God really desires. And Mary, this unmarried teenage girl in a small town in a tiny country in the Middle East that has been occupied by the Roman Empire and ruled over by Caesar, the Son of God, understands what is happening. As she says in Luke chapter 1, God has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant, scattered the proud, brought down the powerful, lifted up the lowly, filled the hungry with good things, and sent the rich away empty. Mary knew. Mary gave herself fully to the work of the Lord. So in conclusion, Brian McLaren observes, that's what it means to be alive in the adventure of Jesus. We present ourselves to God, our bodies, our stories, our futures, our possibilities, even our limitations. Here I am, we say with Mary, the Lord's servant. Let it be with me according to your will. And then, last week we had lit a candle for the prophets who spoke hope into the world. This week we lit a candle for Mary then, who courageously trusted and gave birth to what we thought was impossible. Let us then, in our lives, dare to believe that what seems impossible to us is possible with God. And may our believing be more than just mental assent, but may we surrender ourselves to God and cooperate with his creative power in us, for us, and through us to bring forth the new creation that God has made available through the wondrous gift of Jesus. And so we light that candle for Mary. We then went and we sang a song, just 2 verses of O Come, Emmanuel. And I just want to read those for you as we close. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. O come, desire of nations, bind all peoples in one heart and mind. Bid envy, strife, and quarrels cease. Fill all the world with heaven's peace. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. So may we be a people who hear the stories of the impossible possibilities that God made actual, and may we live confidently in the promise that the God of Sarah, Elizabeth, and Mary is the same God that is still working toward what we have not yet fully imagined. Be people of possibility, because with God, all things are possible. It's good to be with you again. Love you all. Hope that your holiday season is all it can be in these very difficult times. But never lose hope and trust in the God of the impossible to make it possible.